The man at the end of the table hadn't said a word in 40 minutes, and nobody had noticed yet. That was the thing about Murray Gillespie. He had a way of sitting in a room that made you think the chair was empty. Not because he was small. He wasn't. He was built the way old trees are built, wide through the shoulders and rooted to whatever ground he stood on. But he had learned, over 73 years of living, that silence was a form of armour, and he wore it the way other men wore medals. It was the first Saturday of July, and the Brenton family reunion had taken over the backyard of Ted and Carol Brenton's property, just outside of Barrie, Ontario. Folding tables draped in red check plastic, a propane grill the size of a small car, children running through sprinklers, the smell of charcoal and citronella and someone's potato salad that had been sitting in the sun just a little too long. The kind of afternoon that feels like Canada distilled into a single afternoon. Cold Canadian Tire lawn chairs, warm Molson in a styrofoam cooler, and someone's uncle who had brought his own hot sauce because he didn't trust anyone else's. Murray Gillespie was not a Brenton. He was Ted's neighbour, had been for 11 years, and Ted invited him every summer because Murray had shoveled Ted's driveway every winter for 11 years without being asked and without wanting anything in return. Ted had stopped trying to figure Murray out. He just made sure there was a lawn chair with his name on it and a plate of food that found its way to him whether he asked for it or not. Murray sat at the far end of the long table, in the shade of the old sugar maple that Carol kept saying she'd have trimmed, and never did. He had a paper plate in front of him with a piece of cornbread and some coleslaw he hadn't touched. He held a glass of iced tea in both hands, the way very old men sometimes hold things, not drinking, just holding, like the cold of the glass was enough. He was watching a man across the yard named Kevin Sproul. Kevin Sproul had arrived 2 hours ago with Carol's niece, whose name was Bridget, and who had been dating Kevin for 4 months and already seemed to be wondering whether that had been a good idea. Kevin was 41 years old, broad-chested in the way that gym memberships produce, with a loud laugh and the kind of confidence that fills whatever room it enters. He had introduced himself to everyone within the first 20 minutes, which was impressive at a gathering of 43 people. Murray had watched Kevin work his way around the yard like a man who had done this before, who understood that family gatherings were a kind of auditorium, and that if you moved fast enough and talked loud enough, you became the show before anyone had agreed to buy a ticket. By the time Kevin reached the cluster of lawn chairs near the grill, he had already mentioned that he had his own contracting business, that he drove a 3/4-ton pickup, and that he had once met Don Cherry at a Tim Hortons in Sudbury, and the man was exactly what you'd expect. Murray had noted all of this the way you note weather. What happened next was the thing that changed the afternoon. Ted's brother-in-law, a retired schoolteacher named Bernard Acton, had been talking quietly with 2 of his cousins about his own time in the Canadian Forces, a brief, unremarkable stint in the 80s that Bernard himself described as mostly paperwork in Petawawa, delivered with the kind of self-deprecating honesty that tends to disarm people. Bernard was not a storyteller. He was the kind of man who told the truth, even when a slightly larger version of it would have served him just as well. Kevin Sproul drifted into that conversation like smoke under a door. "You were forces," Kevin said, pulling a chair over without being invited. "No kidding. Me too." Bernard looked up. "Oh yeah? Which branch army?" Kevin said. "Infantry. Couple tours?" Bernard nodded slowly. There was a pause that lasted just a half-second longer than it should have. "Where'd you serve?" Kevin picked up his beer. The easy confidence never left his face. "Afghanistan," he said. 2 rotations. Kandahar province mostly. Panjwai district if you want to get specific. He said the names the way people say names they have rehearsed, smoothly, without hesitation, which is not the same thing as saying them correctly. Bernard nodded again. He didn't say anything for a moment. "CAF?" he asked, meaning Kandahar Airfield, the main base. "Sometimes," Kevin said, "mostly Fob Wilson." Bernard seemed to consider this. He said, which is a sound Canadians use to fill space while they are deciding something. More cousins had drifted over by now. Kevin had that gravitational pull. 2 of Ted's sons were standing nearby with beers, listening. Bridget was somewhere behind Kevin, close enough to hear, with the careful expression of a woman who is gathering information. Kevin kept talking. He was good at it. He described the heat. Dry heat, not like Ontario humidity, hits you like opening an oven, and the weight of the kit, and the dust that got into everything, and the sound of the Chinooks coming in. He talked about what it was like to be 23 and standing in a place where the ground itself felt hostile. He was precise in the way that people who have done their research are precise. He knew enough to sound like he knew more. At the far end of the table, Murray Gillespie set down his glass of iced tea. He did it quietly. There was no dramatic scrape of the chair. He simply set down the glass, and then he stood up, and he walked over, and he pulled an empty chair to the edge of the group and sat down in it. Nobody paid much attention to him. He was an old man arriving quietly, which is not the kind of thing that stops a conversation. He sat and listened for another minute or two. Kevin was talking about a patrol outside the wire. He was using the right words. Murray listened to the words. Then Murray spoke. "Which battalion?" he said. Kevin turned to look at him. He did the thing that people do when they haven't noticed someone is in the room. A small recalibration of the face, the eyes adjusting. He saw an old man with white hair and a plaid shirt, holding nothing, looking at him with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was not warm either. It was simply attentive, the way an exam is attentive. "The 1 RCR, Kevin said. 1st Battalion, Royal Canadian Regiment." He said it without hesitation. He had done his homework. Murray nodded. He looked at the ground for a moment, then back up. "What company?" "Charlie," Kevin said. Murray nodded again. He said, "Who was your OC in Panjwai?" Kevin blinked once. Something crossed his face. Not panic, not yet, but the first awareness of a current beneath the water. It was a Major Holt," he said. "Think it was Holt." Murray looked at him for a long moment. "What was the name of the road you used going south from Wilson?" he asked. "The main route." Kevin shifted in his chair. "We took different routes," he said. "For security reasons, you know how it is." "Sure," Murray said. He didn't press. He just sat there, and the not pressing was somehow worse than pressing would have been. The group around them had gone very quiet. Ted's older son had stopped mid-sip. Bernard Acton was looking at his boots. Bridget had gone perfectly still somewhere at the edge of the circle. Murray said, "Tell me about Op Medusa. It was a real thing." Operation Medusa, September 2006, one of the largest NATO ground offensives in the history of the Afghan mission, fought primarily in the Panjwai district of Kandahar province. Canadians at the tip of the spear. 3 Canadian soldiers killed in the first days. Some of the most intense combat Canadian forces had seen since Korea. Kevin opened his mouth. He closed it. "The big push in '06, Murray said, not helpfully, just factually. "Charlie Company would have been right in the middle of it." Kevin said, Yeah, it was intense." "What was your role?" A pause. We were doing clearance operations mostly." "Clearance from which direction?" "They came in from the north initially." Kevin looked at Murray with an expression that had changed significantly in the last 90 seconds. The easy confidence was still there, but it had developed a hairline crack, and through that crack you could see something that was not confidence at all. "It was a long time ago," Kevin said. "I don't remember every detail." "Sure," Murray said again. He reached down and picked up his iced tea from where he'd set it on the grass. He took a sip. He looked at the maple tree for a moment, the way you look at something when you are deciding whether to say the next thing or let it go. He said it. "I asked because I was there, not in '06. Earlier than that, different war, different desert." He paused, but a lot of the same questions. The table was silent. "I'm not saying anything," Murray said. He looked at Kevin, and his voice was entirely level. "A man's service is between him and his conscience. I've got no interest in making a scene at Ted's party." He glanced over at Ted, who was standing by the grill pretending to check on something that didn't need checking. "But I'll tell you what I know. I know Panjwai. I know Fob Wilson. I know what Charlie Company did in September of 2006, because I've sat with men who were there, men who've never talked about it to anyone except other men who were there, because the other men who were there are the only ones they believe could possibly understand." He set his glass down again. Those men carry that with them every day. And most of them don't talk about it at parties. The silence that followed was a particular kind of silence. Not the silence of a room where nothing is happening. The silence of a room where everything that needed to happen has already happened, and everyone present knows it. Kevin Sproul looked at Murray Gillespie, and for a moment, just a moment, his face showed something that might have been shame. It was hard to tell. It was the kind of face that had practiced not showing things for a long time. He said, "I was in the reserves. I was attached for a while. It wasn't a full." Murray put up one hand, not dismissively, just a hand raised like a door being gently closed. "You don't have to explain it to me," he said. "I'm just an old man at a barbecue." He picked up his paper plate with the cornbread and the coleslaw, and he walked back to his chair under the maple tree, and he sat down, and he ate his cornbread, and he didn't say another word about it for the rest of the afternoon. Kevin Sproul was at the party for another 40 minutes. He laughed less than he had before. He left before dessert, and Bridget stayed. Nobody really talked about what had happened, the way Canadians often don't talk directly about things. But the circle around the grill shifted somehow in the hour after. Ted's older son, whose name was Patrick, and who had been standing there listening, went and sat beside Murray under the maple tree. He brought him a piece of Carol's butter tart, which was the best thing on the table, and everyone knew it. He sat down and didn't say anything at first, and Murray didn't say anything either, and they sat there in the shade together like two people who didn't need to fill the space. After a while, Patrick said, "What war was it? You said a different war." Murray ate a bite of the butter tart. He chewed it. He looked at the children running through the sprinkler. "Doesn't matter," he said. Patrick nodded slowly. "Okay." They sat there for another few minutes, and then Patrick said, "Were you there a long time?" Murray was quiet for long enough that Patrick wondered if he'd heard the question. Then he said, "Long enough." And Patrick understood, the way young people sometimes understand things they haven't lived. Not the facts of it, not the texture of it, not the particular weight that certain years put on a man's shoulders, but the shape of it, the outline. He understood that there was something in Murray Gillespie's past that Murray Gillespie did not carry lightly, and that the reason Murray had walked across the yard and sat down in that circle and asked those questions was not because he wanted to make Kevin Sproul look small. It was because of the men Murray had known who never came home, and the men who came home changed, and the ones who talked about it only in certain rooms with certain other men in voices that never got loud, because what they had been through had long since moved past the need for an audience. Those men didn't get their names in any story Kevin Sproul would ever tell. Murray Gillespie thought they deserved at least that much. He finished the butter tart. He folded the paper napkin and tucked it into his shirt pocket because he didn't see a garbage can nearby, and he had been in enough places where you cleaned up after yourself without being asked. The children were still running through the sprinkler. The sun was dropping behind the Brentons' cedar hedge. Someone put on a tragically hip album from a Bluetooth speaker on the deck, and for a while the hip played softly across the yard, and that felt appropriate in a way that was hard to explain, but that most Canadians would have understood without needing it explained. Murray sat under the maple tree, and he was quiet, and he looked at the light coming through the leaves, and he thought about things he did not say out loud. Now here is what you need to understand, if you have followed this story to the end. Murray Gillespie will not tell you what he did. He will not post it. He will not wear it. If you asked him directly, he would probably say something like, "I was just in the forces for a while," and then change the subject to whatever was on your plate, because he is genuinely more interested in that. But there are records, if you knew where to look. There is a name in a regimental history that might be his, attached to a citation that says things in the careful language of military documents that translate in plain terms to, "This man went somewhere terrifying and did not leave the people beside him behind." He never told Ted this. He never told Carol. He never told Patrick, who sat beside him under the maple tree eating nothing and thinking quite a lot. He has never told anyone at a party. That is the thing about men like Murray Gillespie. They are not rare in the way that diamonds are rare, valuable because they are scarce. They are rare in the way that clean water used to be rare. Something you might not notice until it's gone, and then you realize it was the thing everything else depended on. Kevin Sproul drove home that evening and probably told himself a story about what had happened, the way people do. Maybe in his version the old man was just suspicious. Maybe in his version the whole thing was a misunderstanding. Murray Gillespie drove home in his 2009 Silverado that he'd bought used and maintained himself, and he made a cup of red rose tea, and he sat at his kitchen table by the window, and he looked out at the dark yard, and he thought about a patrol that happened a very long time ago in a place very far from Barrie, Ontario. He thought about the name of the man to his left on that patrol. He thought about the name of the man to his right. He said neither name out loud because there was no one in the kitchen to say them to. But he remembered them, precisely, and without compromise, and without anyone watching. That is what real honour looks like, and you will almost never see it coming.